Billionaire thought he left unnoticed, but the quiet observer in the forest knew it all. This is a powerful and mysterious story. He thought no one saw him slip into the woods that night. But hidden among the trees, someone was watching. Someone who knew far more than he could ever imagine. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. A tale of secrets, redemption, and the eyes that see everything. The forest has eyes. Not metaphorical ones. Not poetic interpretations of rustling leaves or watchful deer. Actual eyes. Human eyes. Eyes that had witnessed more secrets than any confession booth. More lies than any courtroom. More truths than any diary could hold. Marcus Wellington didn't know this as he stepped from his black Mercedes S-Class into the embrace of towering pines and ancient oaks. The gravel crunched beneath his Italian leather shoes. Shoes that cost more than most people earned in a month. He adjusted his Patek Philippe watch, a nervous habit he'd developed over 43 years of lying to himself and everyone around him. The air smelled of pine needles and earth, of rain that had fallen 3 days prior and still clung to the moss-covered stones like memories refusing to fade. Marcus breathed deeply, believing himself alone, believing himself unobserved, believing, as wealthy, powerful men often do, that the world bent to accommodate his need for privacy. He was wrong on all counts. 50 meters away, concealed behind a massive Douglas fir that had stood sentinel for 200 years, someone watched. Not with malice, not with judgment, but with the patient curiosity of one who has made watching into an art form. The observer had been there for hours, waiting, knowing that eventually, Marcus Wellington would come. Because Marcus always came. Every Thursday at 4:47 p.m. Like clockwork. Like a secret written in the language of routine. The forest knew his schedule. The birds had learned to expect his arrival. The deer had memorized the sound of his expensive engine. And the quiet observer had documented every single visit for the past 9 months, creating a chronicle of a man's unraveling that would eventually reshape the lives of thousands. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, Marcus walked deeper into the woods, his footsteps heavy with the burden of what he carried. Not in his hands, but in his heart. A secret so profound, so devastating, that it had transformed him from a man who once believed in honor into a creature of shadows and deception. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Marcus followed a path that wasn't quite a path, more of a suggestion worn into the undergrowth by his repeated visits. He didn't know that someone had carefully maintained this trail, removing branches that might impede his passage, ensuring that his route remained clear and comfortable. The observer was nothing if not considerate. After 10 minutes of walking, Marcus reached his destination, a small clearing where a fallen oak had created a natural bench. Here, surrounded by the indifferent beauty of nature, Marcus Wellington, billionaire, philanthropist, husband, father, fraud, allowed his carefully constructed mask to slip. He sat heavily, as though the weight he carried could be transferred to the earth through sheer gravitational force. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a photograph, its edges worn from repeated handling. Even from a distance, the observer could see that it showed a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark curls and a smile that could melt glaciers. Marcus stared at the photograph with an expression that contained such a complex mixture of love, grief, guilt, and desperation that it was almost painful to witness. His hands trembled, not from age or cold, but from the seismic force of emotions he usually kept locked behind titanium walls. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photograph, to the forest, to God, to whoever might be listening. "I'm so sorry, Emma." The name echoed through the clearing, and the observer committed it to memory, adding it to the growing file of information that had been meticulously compiled over 9 months of surveillance. Emma. A name that would prove to be the key to understanding everything that followed. Marcus didn't cry. Men like him had forgotten how decades ago, but his face contorted with the effort of holding back tears that desperately wanted to fall. He pressed the photograph to his chest, rocking slightly, a gesture that seemed almost childlike in its raw vulnerability. "I thought I was protecting you," he continued, speaking to the ghost in the photograph. "I thought if I could just make it all go away, you could live a normal life. But I see now that I was only protecting myself. I was a coward, Emma. I am a coward." The confession hung in the air like morning mist. The forest absorbed it, held it, kept it safe in the vault of its ancient silence. And the observer recorded it, understanding that this moment, this raw admission of guilt, was the beginning of something that would either destroy Marcus Wellington or save him. Perhaps both. Marcus sat in that clearing for another 27 minutes. The observer knew because they timed it as they timed everything. In those 27 minutes, Marcus spoke to the photograph 13 more times, each confession peeling back another layer of the carefully constructed lie that was his public life. He spoke of board meetings where he'd authorized decisions that enriched shareholders while devastating communities. He spoke of bribes paid to government officials, of environmental regulations circumvented, of safety inspections falsified. He spoke of a corporate empire built on the fractures of other people's lives, on the exploitation of desperation, on the monetization of human suffering. But mostly he spoke of Emma, of how he'd failed her, of how his choices, made in boardrooms and private clubs, in moments of weakness disguised as strength, had led to her disappearance from his life. The details were fragmented, delivered in the disjointed syntax of grief, but the observer pieced them together like a puzzle constructed over months of similar confessions. Emma was Marcus's daughter from a relationship that had occurred during his first marriage. A daughter he'd never publicly acknowledged. A daughter whose mother had threatened to expose his infidelity unless he paid her off. A daughter who had grown up knowing her father's face only from magazine covers and news broadcasts. A daughter who had finally reached out to him 3 years ago, seeking not money but connection, only to be met with lawyers and non-disclosure agreements and the cold machinery of damage control. A daughter who had died 8 months ago in a car accident that might not have been an accident at all. They said it was brake failure. Marcus told the photograph, his voice breaking. "But I know, Emma. I know he had her killed. Dmitry Volkov. He knew she was going to go public, knew she was going to destroy the deal we'd made with his energy consortium. He had her killed, and I let him because I was more afraid of losing my fortune than losing my soul." The observer's breath caught. This was new information. In 9 months of surveillance, Marcus had never before mentioned the name Dmitry Volkov or suggested that his daughter's death had been anything other than a tragic accident. This was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. The observer's hand moved to the recording device concealed in their jacket, ensuring it was capturing every word. Technology and forest coexisted in this space. Ancient woods and modern surveillance, natural silence and digital memory, the organic and the engineered working in unexpected harmony. Marcus stood abruptly, the sudden movement startling a family of sparrows from a nearby bush. He walked to the edge of the clearing, where the ground dropped away into a small ravine. For a moment, a terrible, crystalline moment, the observer thought he might jump. But Marcus simply stood there, staring into the depths, perhaps seeing his own abyss reflected back at him. "I could end it," he said quietly. "One step and all of this guilt, all of this shame, all of this crushing weight gone. They'd find my body, and everyone would think I was just another middle-aged man who couldn't handle the stress. They'd never know about Emma. They'd never know about Volkov. My legacy would remain intact, and my other children, my legitimate children, would inherit an empire built on blood money and never know the truth." The observer tensed, preparing to intervene if necessary. They hadn't spent 9 months documenting Marcus Wellington's unraveling just to watch him take the easy way out. But Marcus stepped back from the edge, shaking his head. "But that's what a coward would do," he continued. "And I've been a coward long enough. Emma deserves better. She deserved better. And maybe it's not too late to give her the only thing I have left to offer, the truth." He turned back toward the clearing, and for one heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to sweep directly over the observer's hiding place. But he didn't react, didn't pause, didn't give any indication that he'd seen anything unusual. He simply walked back to his natural bench, sat down once more, and stared at Emma's photograph as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening. "I'm going to make it right," Marcus promised. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to expose everything. Volkov, the board, all of it. They'll destroy me. I know that. I'll lose everything. But maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe that's what justice looks like. Not punishment from others, but the courage to punish yourself by telling the truth." The observer felt something unexpected. Admiration. After 9 months of watching Marcus Wellington commit what amounted to emotional self-flagellation, after documenting his guilt and witnessing his suffering, this was the first time the observer had seen anything resembling genuine courage. It was broken courage, desperate courage, courage born from having no other options, but it was courage nonetheless. Marcus sat in silence for another 15 minutes, then carefully returned Emma's photograph to his jacket pocket. He stood, brushed off his expensive trousers, and began the walk back to his car. His gait was different now, less burdened, perhaps, but also less certain. He walked like a man who had made a decision that would change everything but wasn't entirely sure he had the strength to follow through. The observer let him pass, remaining absolutely still until the sound of the Mercedes's engine faded into the distance. Only then did they emerge from behind the Douglas fir, stretching limbs that had remained motionless for nearly 2 hours. They pulled out a small notebook because despite all the technology, some things were still better committed to paper, and wrote, "Day 243. Subject has finally named the target. Dmitry Volkov. Connection between Emma's death and Volkov's business dealings now confirmed. Subject claims intention to expose corruption. Viability of follow-through, uncertain but promising. Next steps. Investigate Volkov, establish protection protocols, prepare for potential intervention." The observer paused, pen hovering over paper, then added one more line. "Subject is finally ready to become the hero his daughter needed him to be. Question remains. Is he strong enough to survive his own heroism?" The notebook was closed, returned to a weatherproof pocket. The observer took one last look at the clearing, at the place where Marcus Wellington came to confess his sins to a forest that kept all secrets, and smiled. Not with pleasure at another's pain, but with the satisfaction of someone who has planted a seed and finally sees the first green shoot breaking through the soil. Because the observer wasn't just watching Marcus Wellington unravel. The observer was carefully, methodically, helping him find the courage to destroy himself in the only way that mattered, by telling the truth. The forest grew darker as the sun continued its descent. Shadows lengthened, transforming familiar shapes into something mysterious and ancient. The observer moved through these shadows with practiced ease, following a different path back to civilization. A path that Marcus didn't know existed, through woods that held secrets within secrets. As they walked, the observer reflected on how they'd come to occupy this strange position. Guardian angel and documenter of sins, protector and prosecutor. The hidden hand that shaped events while remaining forever unseen. It was a role they'd never imagined taking when this all began 9 months ago, but now they couldn't imagine doing anything else. Because some stories need to be told. Some truths need to be spoken. And some people need a witness, not to judge them, but to ensure that when they finally find the courage to do the right thing, someone is there to record it, to protect it, to make sure their moment of heroism isn't erased by those who profit from silence. The observer reached their vehicle, a nondescript SUV that could belong to anyone, and drove away from the forest, leaving behind only the whisper of tire on gravel and the memory of a billionaire's confession. But they would return tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, because Marcus Wellington's story wasn't finished. It was only beginning. 9 months earlier, the ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel gleamed with the kind of ostentatious wealth that made even mirrors feel inadequate. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than most homes cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to such perfection they seemed liquid. Men in tuxedos that fit like second skins mingled with women draped in jewels and designer gowns, creating a human tapestry of excess and privilege. This was Marcus Wellington's natural habitat, and he moved through it with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space. Any space, all spaces. At 43, he was handsome in the way that money makes men handsome. Well-groomed, well-fed, but not too well-fed. Well-rested, well-everything. His hair, touched with distinguished gray at the temples, was cut by a barber who flew in from London quarterly. His teeth, impossibly white, were the product of years of cosmetic dentistry. His posture spoke of private Pilates instructors and ergonomic office furniture that cost as much as a compact car. "Marcus, wonderful speech tonight," said Gerald Brennan, a portly board member whose own fortune came from pharmaceutical patents that kept life-saving medications prohibitively expensive. That bit about Wellington Industries' commitment to sustainable practices. Inspired. Absolutely inspired. Marcus smiled the smile he'd perfected over 2 decades of corporate ladder climbing. Warm but not too warm. Friendly but maintaining appropriate distance. Genuine enough to seem sincere but calculated enough to hide any actual emotion. "Thank you, Gerald. We're really trying to position ourselves as industry leaders in environmental responsibility. The younger generation demands it, and frankly, it's good business." The lie came easily because Marcus had told it so many times he almost believed it himself. Wellington Industries' commitment to sustainability extended about as far as their marketing budget did, which was to say it was all veneer and no substance, a carefully constructed facade that looked impressive in annual reports and corporate presentations but meant absolutely nothing in terms of actual environmental policy. "Smart, very smart," Gerald agreed, already eyeing the seafood bar where jumbo shrimp arranged like tiny pink skyscrapers awaited consumption. "Well, don't let me monopolize you. I'm sure everyone wants a piece of your time tonight." Marcus nodded graciously and watched Gerald waddle away toward his crustacean destiny. For a moment, alone in the crowd, Marcus felt the familiar emptiness that had been growing inside him like a tumor. Slow, persistent, and impossible to ignore once you acknowledged its existence. When had it started? He couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. Maybe it had always been there, this hollowness, just masked by ambition and the relentless forward momentum of success. Or maybe it had begun 5 years ago when his first marriage dissolved under the weight of his infidelity. Or maybe it was 10 years ago when he'd authorized that factory opening in Southeast Asia, knowing full well that safety standards were suggestions at best and that worker exploitation was not just probable but guaranteed. Or maybe, and this thought sent ice through his veins, maybe it started 23 years ago when a young woman named Melissa Hartley told him she was pregnant, and his first thought wasn't joy or even fear but calculation. How much would it cost to make this problem disappear? "Penny for your thoughts?" Marcus turned to find his wife, Victoria, gliding toward him with champagne flutes in hand. At 38, she was still stunning, though her beauty had migrated from the natural grace of youth to the carefully maintained elegance of wealth. Her trainer, nutritionist, dermatologist, and cosmetic surgeon formed a team dedicated to ensuring that gravity and time remained only theoretical problems. Just thinking about the quarterly reports, Marcus lied, accepting the champagne. "Revenue is up, but market volatility has me concerned." Victoria's eyes, enhanced by subtle cosmetic procedures that had left them permanently wide and luminous, flickered with something that might have been disappointment. How long had it been since he'd shared an honest thought with her? Years, probably. Their marriage had become a business arrangement. She provided the appearance of domestic stability and social grace. He provided unlimited access to wealth and status. Love, if it had ever existed, was now just another line item in the contract of their union. "You work too hard," Victoria said, the words automatic, part of the script they'd written together over 12 years of marriage. "You should learn to relax at these events. Enjoy them." "I do enjoy them," Marcus replied, another automatic response in their automated relationship. "Nothing I love more than celebrating another successful quarter with the people who made it possible." The lie detector in his brain, the one he'd tried to disable but which had grown louder over the years, screamed, because he didn't enjoy these events. He found them tedious, superficial, and exhausting. He found the people shallow and their conversations meaningless. He found himself wondering, with increasing frequency, whether this was all there was: wealth accumulation followed by wealth display followed by death, leaving behind only a foundation with your name on it and children who knew your net worth better than your favorite color. Marcus, Victoria. The voice belonged to Thomas Chun, Wellington Industries' chief operating officer and the closest thing Marcus had to a friend in the corporate Shark Tank. Come join us. We're discussing the Volkov deal, and your perspective would be invaluable. Dmitry Volkov. The name conjured images of Moscow oligarchs and questionable business practices, of rubles laundered through shell corporations and political connections that extended into the highest echelons of multiple governments. Volkov Energy wanted to partner with Wellington Industries on a massive project that would extract natural gas from previously protected wilderness areas in Alaska. The profit margins were staggering. The environmental impact would be catastrophic. The ethical implications were nightmare fuel. Marcus had authorized preliminary negotiations 3 months ago. Of course, Marcus said, allowing Thomas to guide him toward a cluster of executives and their perfectly curated spouses. What's the latest? As Thomas launched into an update about negotiations and terms, Marcus felt himself splitting into two people. The Marcus who stood in this ballroom, nodding and smiling and asking intelligent questions about market positioning and regulatory workarounds, and the Marcus who watched from some distant interior space, horrified by every word that came out of his own mouth. How had he become this person? When had the compromise of his principles stopped feeling like compromise and started feeling like inevitability? Was there a single moment when he'd crossed a line, or had he eroded his own morality so gradually that he hadn't noticed until he was standing in this ballroom, discussing the destruction of an ecosystem with the same casual tone someone might use to order a latte? The environmental impact study is mostly a formality, Thomas was saying. We've already identified the researchers who'll produce the results we need. It'll cost us consulting fees, research grants, the usual, but it's a negligible expense compared to the projected returns. Buying scientific integrity. That's what Thomas had just described. Though he'd wrapped it in such benign language it almost sounded legitimate. And Marcus was nodding, agreeing, because that's what successful executives did. They found solutions to problems, and if buying the truth wasn't available, buying a different truth was perfectly acceptable. What about public pushback? Victoria asked, surprising everyone. She usually avoided business discussions, preferring to focus on charity galas and interior design projects. Environmental groups have gotten quite vocal lately. Won't they cause problems? We'll handle it, Marcus heard himself say. Public relations, social media campaigns, donations to strategic nonprofits to buy their silence. It's all budgeted into the project. Besides, we'll create jobs, local jobs. Hard to maintain opposition when you're putting money in people's pockets. The strategy was tried and true. Divide communities with economic promises. Isolate the opposition as privileged environmentalists who cared more about caribou than human welfare. Control the narrative through strategic media placements and political contributions. It would work because it always worked. Truth was just another commodity, available to whoever could afford the best marketing. Brilliant as always, Thomas said, raising his glass. To the Volkov deal. May it be as profitable as we all hope. They toasted, crystal clinking against crystal, champagne bubbles rising like tiny prayers to the gods of capitalism. Marcus drank, tasting nothing. The champagne might as well have been ash in his mouth. The evening wore on. Marcus shook hands, made small talk, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and pretended that the hollow space inside him wasn't expanding with each passing hour. By the time they reached their penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle, 47th floor, $3 million, views of Elliott Bay that never failed to impress visitors. He was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Victoria disappeared into her bedroom. They'd maintained separate rooms for the past 5 years, another unspoken acknowledgement of their marriage's true nature. Marcus poured himself a scotch from a decanter that cost more than most people's monthly rent and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he'd conquered. Seattle sprawled below him, a constellation of lights that represented millions of lives, each one presumably as complex and meaningful as his own. Somewhere down there, people were falling in love and falling apart, celebrating triumphs and mourning losses, being born and dying, experiencing the full spectrum of human existence. And he was up here in his climate-controlled, hermetically sealed tower, feeling nothing, living a life that looked enviable from the outside but felt like slow suffocation from within. His phone buzzed. Marcus glanced at the screen, expecting another business email, and felt his heart stop. The message was from an unknown number. "Mr. Wellington, my name is Emma Hartley. I'm your daughter. I think it's time we met." The scotch glass slipped from his fingers, tumbling in slow motion toward the hardwood floor. Marcus watched it fall with strange detachment, noting how the amber liquid caught the light, how the crystal rotated through the air with almost ballet-like grace. It shattered with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the apartment's silence, 1,000 fragments spreading across the floor like a supernova. Emma Hartley, the daughter he'd paid Melissa Hartley $300,000 to never acknowledge publicly. The daughter who had grown up with his last name and his DNA but none of his presence. The daughter who existed as a line item in his accountant's files under confidential settlements, but nowhere in his heart. Or so he'd convinced himself. Marcus stared at the message, his mind racing through implications and consequences. How had she gotten his number? What did she want? Money? Recognition? Revenge? All of the above. A follow-up message arrived. "I'm not looking for money. I just want to meet my father. I'll be at the Starbucks on Pine Street tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll understand if you don't come, but I hope you will. I've waited 23 years. I can give you one more day." Marcus stood frozen, phone in hand, broken glass at his feet. His carefully constructed world beginning to crack along fissures he'd always known were there, but had chosen to ignore. Because that's what successful people did. They ignored uncomfortable truths, buried inconvenient realities, and built empires on foundations of selective amnesia. But Emma Hartley wasn't going to stay buried. She was real, she was out there, and she wanted to meet him. The daughter he'd never held, never watched grow up, never been a father to in any meaningful sense. The living, breathing proof of his cowardice and moral failure. Marcus should have called his lawyer. He should have initiated damage control protocols. He should have treated this like any other crisis, something to be managed, contained, and ultimately neutralized with strategic applications of wealth and legal pressure. Instead, he found himself typing, "I'll be there." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, before the rational, calculating part of his brain could reassert control. The message delivered with a soft whoosh, irrevocable. Marcus stood in the spreading pool of spilled scotch, surrounded by broken crystal, looking out at the city below, and wondered if this was what redemption felt like. Terrifying and inevitable, unwanted and necessary. The universe finally coming to collect on decades of unpaid debts. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Marcus Wellington would meet his daughter for the first time. And nothing. Not his wealth, not his power, not his carefully constructed defenses, would ever be the same. The Starbucks on Pine Street was achingly ordinary, which somehow made everything more surreal. Marcus had arrived 20 minutes early, a habit from decades of business meetings where tardiness was interpreted as weakness, and secured a corner table that provided clear sight lines to the entrance while also offering some privacy. He'd changed his outfit 3 times that morning, finally settling on what his stylist called casual elegant. Designer jeans that cost $800, a cashmere sweater, a leather jacket that was both expensive and understated. He wanted to look approachable but not poor, relatable but not pretending to be something he wasn't. Then he'd realized the absurdity of his concern. Emma was his daughter, not a business prospect. What did it matter what he wore? Except it mattered enormously, because clothes were armor, and Marcus had never been more naked than he felt right now, sitting in this corporate coffee shop, waiting to meet the child he'd abandoned before she was even born. The barista called out drink orders in that peculiar Starbucks shorthand that transformed English into something approximating code. Marcus had ordered a black coffee. No fancy modifications, No complicated requests, and it sat in front of him now, cooling and untouched. His hands trembled slightly whenever he reached for the cup, so he'd stopped trying. 2:03 p.m. She was late, or maybe she wasn't coming. Maybe she'd gotten cold feet. Reconsidered the wisdom of meeting a father who'd paid her mother to stay silent for 23 years. Marcus wouldn't blame her. If their positions were reversed, he wouldn't come either. 2:07 p.m. Marcus checked his phone compulsively, seeing no new messages, feeling relief and disappointment in equal measure. This was his opportunity to leave, to escape, to return to his penthouse and his carefully ordered life and pretend this had never happened. He could have his lawyer send a message. Inappropriate timing, not suitable for contact. Please direct all communications through legal counsel. He was halfway to standing when the door opened and she walked in. Marcus knew it was Emma immediately, knew it with the cellular certainty that transcends logic. She looked nothing like him. She had her mother's dark curls, her mother's delicate features, her mother's petite frame. But something in the way she moved, some indefinable quality in her bearing, shouted Wellington. Confidence without arrogance. Purpose without aggression. Intelligence that announced itself through presence rather than words. She was beautiful, and Marcus felt his heart break in ways he hadn't known were possible. This was his daughter, his child, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, the person he should have protected and nurtured and loved but had instead treated as a problem to be solved with money and legal documents. Emma scanned the coffee shop, and when her eyes landed on Marcus, something complicated flickered across her face. Recognition, uncertainty, hope, fear, anger, longing, all compressed into a single moment of visual contact. Then she smiled, and Marcus saw himself in that smile. The slight asymmetry, the way it started on the left side before spreading to the right, the unconscious gesture of touching her earlobe when nervous. She approached, and Marcus stood on legs that felt unreliable. They faced each other across the small table, separated by 23 years and $300,000 and choices that could never be unmade. "Mr. Wellington," Emma said, extending her hand formally. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Wellington. Not Dad. Not even Marcus." The formality was a shield, and Marcus understood it because he'd spent his life hiding behind similar shields. "Emma," he replied, taking her hand. Her grip was firm but not aggressive, confident but not combative. I'm glad you reached out." The lie sat between them like a third person at the table. Or was it a lie? Marcus didn't know anymore. He was glad and terrified, grateful and resentful, eager and desperate to flee. They sat. Emma ordered a green tea, the most inexpensive item on the menu, Marcus noticed. And when it arrived, she wrapped her hands around the cup as though drawing warmth from it, despite the coffee shop's comfortable temperature. "I'm not here for money," Emma said, cutting through the awkward silence with directness that Marcus found both refreshing and painful. "I want you to know that up front. Mom left me enough to pay for college, and I work part-time at a bookstore. I'm not rich, but I'm okay." "I didn't think," Marcus began, then stopped because he absolutely had thought that. It was his default assumption. Everyone wanted money. That's how the world worked in his experience. "What I mean is, that's not why I came. I wanted to meet you." Another lie detector alarm screamed in his head. Had he wanted to meet her? Or had he simply felt obligated? Could he even tell the difference anymore? "Tell me about yourself," Marcus said, falling back on the conversational strategies that served him in business settings. "What are you studying? What are your interests?" Emma laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's what we're doing? Small talk? Pretending this is normal?" "I don't know what we're doing," Marcus admitted, and in that admission felt something crack in his usual defenses. "I don't know what you want from me, Emma. I don't know what I can give you. I don't know how to be your father after 23 years of not being your father." The honesty seemed to surprise both of them. Emma's expression softened slightly, her defensive posture relaxing by degrees. "I'm studying environmental science at UW," she said finally. Which is ironic, I guess, considering your company's environmental record. Direct hit. Marcus felt the impact but tried not to show it. I'm minoring in journalism, Emma continued. I want to write about climate change, corporate responsibility, the intersection of business and environmental policy. I want to hold people accountable for what they do to the planet. She held his gaze when she said this, and Marcus understood that she wasn't just describing her career aspirations. She was drawing battle lines. She was telling him exactly where she stood and daring him to have a problem with it. That's admirable, Marcus said, meaning it. Important work. Is it though? Emma leaned forward, her intensity suddenly focused like a laser. Because your company says environmental responsibility is important, puts it in all your annual reports and corporate messaging. But then you partner with companies like Volkov Energy to drill in protected wilderness. You say one thing publicly and do the opposite privately. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about whether you actually think my work is important or if you're just saying what you think I want to hear. Marcus felt like he'd been punched. Not because her words were unfair, but because they were devastatingly accurate. She'd done her homework, researched Wellington Industries' actual practices versus its public statements, and found the hypocrisy he'd spent years carefully obscuring. You're right, he said quietly. Everything you just said is right. We are hypocrites. I am a hypocrite. I say I care about the environment while making decisions that destroy it. I say I value human welfare while exploiting workers in countries with lax labor laws. I say I want to leave the world better than I found it while actively making it worse in measurable ways. Emma blinked, clearly not expecting such a frank admission. Marcus hadn't expected it either. But sitting across from his daughter, this brilliant, passionate young woman who saw through all his careful constructions, pretense felt not just pointless but obscene. Then why do you do it? Emma asked, and her voice contained genuine curiosity rather than accusation. If you know it's wrong, if you can admit it's wrong, why not change it? Because changing it would cost me everything, Marcus said. My position, my wealth, my power. The board would remove me. Shareholders would revolt. I'd be sued for breach of fiduciary duty. Everything I've built would collapse. So you choose money over morality. Yes, every single day. That's exactly what I do. They sat in silence. These two strangers bound by biology and separated by choices neither had made but both had to live with. Around them, the coffee shop continued its mundane operations. Espresso machines hissed, conversations hummed, transactions occurred. Normal life proceeding as though Marcus's world wasn't cracking apart. Do you want to know about Mom? Emma asked suddenly. About what happened after you paid her off? Marcus wasn't sure he did, but he nodded. She used the money wisely, Emma said. Bought a small house in Tacoma, saved for my college fund, invested the rest conservatively. She never badmouthed you, never told me you were a monster. She just said you weren't ready to be a father, that you'd both made mistakes, and that she wanted better for me than growing up in the shadow of your guilt. Marcus felt tears threatening. Actual tears, something he hadn't experienced in years. The careful numbness he'd cultivated was failing him. She sounds like a remarkable woman, he managed. She was, Emma corrected, and the past tense hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. It was quick, at least. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. Emma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. How would you? You never checked. Never called. Never sent a birthday card or a Christmas present or any indication that you remembered I existed. The money arrived every month like clockwork. Your lawyer was very efficient. But you were a ghost. A very wealthy ghost who paid well to stay invisible. The accusations were delivered without heat, which somehow made them cut deeper. Emma wasn't angry, or if she was, she'd processed that anger years ago. Now she just seemed sad and curious, trying to understand how a man could abandon his own child and still look at himself in the mirror each morning. I thought it was better for you, Marcus said, knowing how pathetic it sounded. I thought if I stayed out of your life, you could build your own identity without the weight of the Wellington name, without the expectations and the scrutiny and the responsibility. Emma finished. You thought it was better for me or better for you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you made the choice that was most convenient, then rationalized it as some kind of noble sacrifice. She was right. God, she was so right it hurt. You're absolutely correct, Marcus admitted. I was a coward. I am a coward. I chose the path of least resistance, convinced myself I was doing it for you when really I was just protecting my career, my marriage, my reputation. I failed you in every possible way, and I don't expect forgiveness. I don't. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed with journalists, shareholders, environmental activists, and curious onlookers who'd been following the Wellington Volkov scandal since it exploded across every major news outlet 6 months ago. The trial of Dmitry Volkov for the murder of Emma Hartley had become the most watched legal proceeding of the decade, a case that had already toppled a corporate empire and exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of international business. Marcus Wellington sat in the witness stand, looking older than his 44 years. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by modest department store clothing. The carefully groomed appearance had given way to something more human. Gray hair no longer artfully dyed, lines of genuine emotion etched into a face that had once been a mask. He'd lost weight, not from personal trainers but from the grinding stress of exposure, testimony, and the systematic dismantling of everything he'd spent his life building. Mr. Wellington, the prosecutor said, approaching with a folder thick with evidence that Marcus himself had provided. Can you tell the court what you heard Mr. Volkov say regarding your daughter, Emma Hartley? Marcus took a breath, his hands steady for the first time in months. He told me that Emma was a problem that needed solving. Those were his exact words. When I said she had a right to speak out about the environmental dangers of our proposed Alaska project, he laughed and said problems only exist if someone is alive to talk about them. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge gavelled for silence. And when did Ms. Hartley die? 3 weeks later. Brake failure. The police ruled it an accident. Marcus's voice broke. But I knew. In my heart, I knew what he'd done. And I said nothing because I was more afraid of losing my fortune than losing my soul. But you're speaking now. Yes. Because of someone who was watching. Someone who recorded everything. Someone who knew I needed a push to do the right thing. The prosecutor nodded and turned to address the judge. Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to call our final witness. Someone who has been instrumental in bringing this case to light, who documented Mr. Wellington's confessions and Mr. Volkov's activities for 9 months before approaching federal authorities. We call Jamie Reeves to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and the quiet observer walked in. Jamie Reeves was not what anyone expected. 32 years old, wearing simple clothing that suggested neither wealth nor poverty, they moved with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent 9 months hiding in forests and following dangerous men without ever being detected. Their eyes were sharp, intelligent, and held something that might have been compassion mixed with steel as Jamie was sworn in. Marcus's gaze met theirs across the courtroom. For 9 months, he'd confessed to an empty forest, never knowing that someone was listening, recording, and carefully building the case that would eventually bring him here. He should have felt violated, betrayed. Instead, he felt grateful. Ms. Reeves, the prosecutor began, can you tell the court how you became involved in this case? Jamie's voice was calm, measured. Emma Hartley was my friend. We met at UW in an environmental science class. She told me about her father, about the billionaire who'd paid her mother off, who'd never acknowledged her existence. She told me she was going to expose the Alaska project, that she had evidence of falsified environmental studies and bribed officials. Jamie paused, collecting themselves. 2 weeks later, she was dead. The police said accident. Her mother's instincts said otherwise, but she was dying of cancer herself and didn't have the strength to fight. Before she passed, she asked me to find the truth. So I did. How did you determine that Mr. Wellington might provide evidence? I researched him extensively. I found that he'd been visiting a specific location in the forest every Thursday for years. I thought if I watched him, if I documented his patterns, I might find something. I never expected what I actually found. The prosecutor displayed photographs on the courtroom screens. Images of Marcus in the forest clearing, holding Emma's photograph, his face contorted with grief. Audio recordings began to play. Marcus's voice confessing to the empty woods, speaking of guilt and cowardice and Dmitry Volkov's implicit threats. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I could just make it all go away, you could live a normal life. But I see now that I was only protecting myself." The entire courtroom heard Marcus's confessions, his pain, his slow journey toward the decision to expose everything. And they heard the moment, 6 months ago, when Jamie had finally revealed themselves. 6 months earlier. The forest Marcus had been in his usual clearing, Emma's photograph in his hands, when a voice spoke from behind him. "You said you were going to make it right. Are you ready?" He'd spun around to find Jamie standing there, recording device visible in their hand, no longer hiding. Marcus's first instinct had been rage. How dare someone invade his privacy, record his most vulnerable moments? But the rage had dissolved almost instantly into something else. Relief. "How long have you been watching me?" he'd asked. 9 months. Since Emma died. Since I promised her mother I'd find the truth. You're the friend. The one she talked about. Jamie. Yes. Emma told me about you. About how brilliant you were. How successful, how powerful. She also told me you were broken. That there was good in you buried under layers of compromise and cowardice. She wanted to believe you could change. I've been watching to see if she was right. Marcus had sat down heavily on his fallen oak bench. And? Was she right? Jamie had approached, sitting beside him, the observer finally becoming a participant. "I think so. You've confessed everything to this forest, Marcus. You've acknowledged your guilt, your cowardice, your complicity in Emma's death. But confession without action is just therapy. Are you ready to actually do something? If I expose Volkov, if I testify about everything, the bribes, the falsified studies, the threats, I'll lose everything. My company, my fortune, probably my freedom. Yes, but you'll gain something too. The chance to be the father Emma always hoped you could be. Not in life, you lost that chance. But in death, by ensuring her death has meaning. By making sure the things she fought for actually matter." Marcus had looked at Jamie, then at Emma's photograph, then at the forest that had kept all his secrets. "What do I need to do?" "Tell the truth. All of it. I have recordings of your confessions. I have evidence of Volkov's activities. I have Emma's research, her documentation of the corruption. But I need you. I need you to stand up in court and testify to everything. To burn down your own empire if that's what justice requires." "I'll do it," Marcus had said, and in those 3 words, he destroyed his old life and begun building something new, present day. The courtroom, the recordings ended. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Jamie concluded their testimony. "Mr. Wellington could have stayed silent," Jamie said. "He could have destroyed my evidence, used his wealth and lawyers to bury the truth. Instead, he chose to help. He provided access to corporate documents, testified before grand juries, wore a wire to record conversations with Volkov and other board members. He systematically dismantled everything he'd built because it was the right thing to do." The prosecutor turned to face the jury. Emma Hartley fought for environmental justice, for corporate accountability, for truth in the face of power. She was murdered for that commitment. Today, because of Mr. Wellington's testimony and Ms. Reeves's documentation, we can ensure her death has meaning. We can hold Dmitry Volkov accountable for murder. We can expose the corruption that treated a young woman's life as an acceptable cost of doing business. The trial continued for 3 more days. Volkov's defense attempted to discredit Marcus's testimony, to paint him as an unreliable witness seeking to reduce his own culpability. But the evidence, the recordings, the documents, the paper trail of bribes and threats, was overwhelming on a gray Thursday afternoon. The jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Dmitry Volkov, one of the world's most powerful oligarchs, would spend the rest of his life in prison. Marcus Wellington, who'd pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corporate fraud and conspiracy, received a sentence of 8 years, reduced because of his cooperation. Wellington Industries had been dissolved, its assets liquidated, with the majority going to an environmental restoration fund established in Emma's name. 3 years later, the forest looked different now, or perhaps Marcus just saw it differently. He'd been released early for good behavior after serving 5 years, and the first place he'd come was here, to the clearing where everything had changed, where he'd confessed his sins to what he'd thought was an empty wilderness. Jamie was already there, sitting on the fallen oak bench, looking hardly any older than that day they'd first revealed themselves. They'd become unlikely friends over the past 3 years, united by Emma's memory and by the strange bond formed between a witness and the person they'd witnessed. "I thought I'd find you here," Jamie said, making room on the bench. Marcus sat, feeling the familiar smooth wood beneath him. First Thursday out of prison. Seemed right to continue the tradition. How does it feel? Being free? Terrifying? Liberating? Complicated? Marcus smiled. A genuine smile, something he'd learned to do again over the past 5 years. "I'm broke, unemployed, infamous, and probably unemployable in any corporate setting. I've never been happier." It was true in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The prison years had been hard, he wouldn't romanticize them. But they'd also been clarifying. Stripped of wealth and power and the identity he'd built around those things, Marcus had finally discovered who he actually was beneath all the construction. Someone capable of courage when it mattered. Someone who could choose principle over convenience. Someone Emma might have been proud to call her father. "Emma's foundation is doing incredible work," Jamie said. "The restoration projects in Alaska, the scholarship program for environmental science students, the watchdog initiatives monitoring corporate environmental compliance. She would have loved seeing it. She created it," Marcus said. "Not the foundation itself, but everything it stands for. Every student it helps, every ecosystem it protects. That's her legacy, not mine. You gave her that legacy by telling the truth, by destroying everything you'd built to make sure her death mattered." "No," Marcus corrected gently. "You gave her that legacy. If you hadn't been watching, hadn't documented everything, hadn't pushed me to act, I would have stayed a coward. I would have confessed to the forest every Thursday and done nothing. You turned my guilt into action." Jamie shrugged. "I just held up a mirror. You're the one who finally looked into it." They sat in comfortable silence, these two people bound by tragedy and transformation. A deer emerged from the undergrowth, unafraid, and regarded them with dark, liquid eyes before moving on. Birds sang in the canopy above. The forest went about its ancient business of growth and decay, death and renewal. "What will you do now?" Jamie asked. "Any plans?" "Actually, yes." Marcus pulled out a worn pamphlet from his jacket. "There's a nonprofit in Tacoma that provides environmental education to low-income communities. They need someone to help with administrative work, grant writing, that sort of thing. It pays barely anything, but the work is meaningful." Emma's mother's hometown, Jamie noted. "Yeah. Seemed right. I can't undo the past, can't bring Emma back, can't repair all the damage I caused over decades of choosing wrong. But I can spend whatever time I have left trying to build something good. Something Emma would have believed in. She would have liked that. She would have liked you, this version of you." Marcus felt tears threatening but didn't fight them. He'd learned to cry again in prison, learned that tears weren't weakness but proof of humanity, evidence that something inside him wasn't completely dead. "I miss her," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to miss someone I never really knew, but I do. I miss the daughter I could have had, the relationship we could have built. I miss who I could have been if I'd made different choices." "The past is gone," Jamie said. "But the future is still being written. Every choice you make from here forward is a chance to be the person Emma believed you could become. They sat until the sun began its descent, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Eventually, they stood, preparing to return to their separate lives. Jamie to continue their work as an investigative journalist specializing in corporate accountability. Marcus to begin his new position helping communities understand environmental science. Same time next week. Jamie asked. Every Thursday at 4:47, Marcus confirmed. Some traditions are worth keeping. They walked out of the forest together, no longer observer and observed but friends united by shared purpose. Behind them, the clearing stood empty once more, holding its secrets as it always had, bearing witness to transformation as patient as tree growth. The forest had watched a broken man confess his sins. It had sheltered an observer who documented those confessions. It had been the stage for the first act of redemption and the setting for ongoing renewal. And it would be their next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and all the Thursdays to come as Marcus Wellington continued his weekly ritual. No longer confessing to empty air but remembering the daughter who'd changed everything, honoring the friend who'd pushed him toward courage, and committing himself anew to being worthy of the second chance he'd been given years later, the final Thursday. Marcus Wellington died on a Thursday, appropriately enough. He was 73 years old and had spent the last 26 years working in environmental education and corporate accountability. The man who'd once been a billionaire CEO died with less than $50,000 to his name, living in a modest apartment, riding the bus to work each day. His obituary ran in all the major papers, but the tone was different from what it might have been decades earlier. Yes, it mentioned his corporate crimes and prison sentence. Yes, it detailed the scandal that had brought down Wellington Industries. But it also chronicled his transformation, his decades of meaningful work, and the lives he'd touched in his second act. The obituary ended with a quote from an interview he'd given on his 70th birthday. I spent the first 43 years of my life building an empire on compromised principles and broken promises. I've spent the last 27 years trying to build something better. A legacy based on truth, service, and the memory of a daughter who deserved so much better than I gave her. I don't know if that's redemption. I'm not sure people like me can be redeemed, but it's the best I can offer. Jamie Reeves, now 58 and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose work had exposed dozens of corporate corruption cases, gave the eulogy at Marcus's memorial service. It was held not in a grand cathedral but in a small community center in Tacoma, packed with environmental activists, former students, and people whose lives had been touched by Marcus's quiet decades of service. Marcus Wellington was a complicated man, Jamie began. He was capable of great cowardice and great courage, of profound moral failure and genuine redemption. For the first half of his life, he chose convenience over conscience. For the second half, he chose differently. Jamie paused, looking at the faces gathered to remember a man who transformed from villain to hero, or at least from villain to someone trying to be better. But I don't want to talk about Marcus. I want to talk about Emma Hartley, the daughter he never knew but who changed everything. Emma believed that people could change, that even the most compromised individuals could choose differently if given the chance and the right push. She believed in accountability but also in redemption. She believed that truth mattered, that courage was possible, and that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but only if people are willing to bend it. Jamie held up a worn photograph, the same one Marcus had carried to the forest every Thursday for decades. Emma at 7 years old, smiling that asymmetric Wellington smile, full of promise and possibility. Marcus used to say that Emma saved him, but really they saved each other. She gave him purpose in her death that he'd failed to find in his life. He gave her the one thing she'd always wanted from him, the courage to do the right thing, even when it cost everything. After the service, Jamie drove to the forest, to the clearing that had witnessed so much transformation. A stone memorial had been placed there years earlier, engraved with simple words. In memory of Emma Hartley who fought for truth and her father, Marcus Wellington who finally found the courage to tell it. Jamie sat on the fallen oak bench, now ancient and covered with moss, and thought about the strange journey that had brought them all here. A young woman's death, a billionaire's confession, an observer's decision to step from shadows into light. The ripples from those choices had spread far beyond anything they could have imagined, touching thousands of lives, protecting ecosystems, holding power accountable. "We did it, Emma," Jamie said to the silent forest. "We made it matter. Your death, your dreams, your belief that people could change. We made it all matter." A breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves in a sound that might have been agreement or might have been just wind. Jamie chose to believe it was agreement as the sun set on that final Thursday, painting the forest in its last golden light. Jamie understood something Marcus had learned decades earlier. The forest always watches, always listens, and always remembers. It had watched a broken man become whole. It had witnessed courage born from cowardice. It had been the stage for a transformation that had changed countless lives, and it would be there for generations to come, holding these stories in its roots and branches, offering shelter to anyone who needed a place to confess their sins, find their courage, and choose to become better than they'd been. The forest has eyes. Human eyes that watch. Human hearts that bear witness. Human hands that record the truth and ensure it isn't lost. The forest has seen everything. And in seeing, it has changed everything. The end. This story is dedicated to everyone who has ever stood at a crossroads between convenience and conscience, and to those who gave them the courage to choose differently. May we all be fortunate enough to have a witness when we're ready to change, and brave enough to be that witness for others. Please like and subscribe for more stories.